Medieval history is one of the most fascinating and well-known topics in history. From knights and kings to inquisitions and the so-called Dark Ages, I think we've all learned something about this era in school, even if it was just a brief overview of some of its most famous figures. But here's the thing, medieval history, along with almost all history, is riddled with misconceptions. For example, during the so-called Dark Ages, grand architectures and inventions and new discoveries were still being made and built. People didn't suddenly become ignorant or stupid after the fall of Rome. Grand cathedrals like Notre Dame and countless other marvels of engineering were created during this time. Countless other inventions and scientific discoveries were made during this time. The term Dark Age is a gross oversimplification of a period filled with technological and cultural advancements. People didn't just stop inventing and creating things just because Rome fell. And also, side tangent here, when I say fall of Rome, I'm talking specifically about the Western Roman Empire. Let's get one thing straight. On this channel, the Byzantine Empire is Rome. They carried the traditions, laws, and identity of the Roman Empire. Even calling them the Byzantines is a modern convenience. They called themselves Romans. I digress. That's really just more of a side point. I'm sorry, I just get pissed about that. The medieval period begins around the 700s with the rise of the Frankish Empire and ends in the 1400s as centralized states began to replace feudalism. It's a period steeped in complexity and depth, which pop culture often oversimplifies or gets outright wrong. Like, watch any medieval movie and look at all the ahistorical things going on. Let's look at one example, Braveheart, which I love as a movie. I like most Mel Gibson movies. But, come on, none of this shit actually happened as portrayed in the movie, at least. Prima Nocturnus, which is one of the catalyst moments in the movies, which sets the whole story into motion, has no real historical basis. There were no lords out there claiming their quote-unquote right to sleep with newlyweds before they get married. A lot of things you see in medieval movies are more modern inventions or something we just sort of tack on to the past to attempt to make it more interesting or relevant to our time. But that is where Manor Lord comes in. Manor Lord is a game that attempts to capture the nuance of medieval life in a way that feels authentic while still being fun and unique. I think it stands out as one of the most innovative and historically immersive games in more recent years. In this video, I want to explore how Manor Lords achieves this balance and why it's a must-play for fans of history and strategy games alike. Manor Lord has you play as a lowly noble or manor lord. So in history, manors were rural areas where land was worked by serfs and peasants who were quasi-owned by the lord of the estate, who was given that position either by service to their lord or because it was passed down hereditarily. In Manor Lords, you don't play as some great king or military leader or some knight on the battlefield, but rather someone who is on one of the lowest rungs of the noble hierarchy, just a rather small cog in the noble makeup of a kingdom. Manor Lords, rather than taking a more macro view of medieval times, zooms into the lives and times of the lowliest people in the medieval realms, the peasants and their direct lord. This focus on the small scale makes the game feel personal and deeply immersive. Unlike other grand strategy games, you feel a connection to your town that starts out as a small colony, which eventually turns into a grand town or city. This game allows you to organically grow your town. You start out, in the base game scenario at least, with only 5 families and not a single building built. You've been given this land by your king, who wants the area to be colonized. You also have to be wary of a rogue baron who has claimed these lands against the orders of your king, but we'll talk about that later. This game does not have a grid system. You can lay out your buildings and roads anywhere you want, and expand into any direction that you want. The only thing that can actually stop you from building buildings is the incline of the land, because unfortunately back then they did not invent excavators yet. The name of this game is Resource Management, and on the top of the screen is a lot of numbers that you're going to have to keep track of. You need base materials that then need to be converted into more specialized materials. For example, you have to chop down trees at a lumber yard. That lumber then needs to be converted into planks, where you take that lumber and take it to a saw pit. Or another example, you need to dig up clay, which then can be taken to a potter building, where it's then converted into tiles. This game has a big focus on refining resources. Much like nowadays, the stuff that you can actually just grab from nature is not as useful or as valuable as the stuff that it can turn into. Another thing you always have to be wary of, especially as your population grows, is how much food you have. At the start, collecting berries and hunting will be able to feed a lot of people, but eventually you do have to turn to farming or importing food to sustain your population. And just like real life, there is not a lot of food to be found in the winter when you need it the most. And farming in this game is based off of real life medieval techniques. One, unlike nowadays, you need a lot of manpower to run a farm, even a small one. There are no tractors or power tools to help sustain a large plot of land. Even in game, when you make a farming plot and you're kind of gridding it out, they do not call it an acre of land. They use a morgen, which is a word used to describe the amount of land a single ox can plow in a single day. The game also takes into effect over-farming the soil and depleting it of its nutrients. It's better to cycle when you farm, which means taking one season off and then planting again the next season, or always constantly revolving different sorts of foods that you plant. Otherwise, you run the risk of ruining the soil, which is a real nice touch of realism and historical immersion. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this game is not entirely about combat, but it is still featured. As a manor lord or noble, you have a duty to protect the people and families of your land, as well as being able to call up troops for your liege lord as needed. In-game, the only real trouble you will have is with bandits, who were a pretty serious problem in medieval times depending on where you lived and the political climate of your kingdom. Obviously, in more centralized states like England or, France, depending on the time period, it wasn't too big of an issue, but assuming a war happens, like the 100 Years' War, there was a shit ton of bandits just roaming around France, or if you look at the Scottish Highlands during most of the time period before it became centralized under the English crown, you also have to deal with the rogue baron, who is claiming the land that you have been given by the king, so eventually you will have to fight him as well. In combat, you don't go into an FPS mode or anything of that sort. You have more Total War-like controls, where you move your troops with a bird's eye view approach and use strategy to defend your town. You get to decide what types of troops you have, and it's up to you to buy or make weapons and armor for them. And once your manor, or castle, not really a castle though, is built, you will even have access to your own routine of knights, who are elite shock troops that you can use. Because they have things like actual armor and good weapons. But even the army mechanics reinforce the historical accuracy. While combat in-game is pretty fun, it still hurts to lose men. When one of your peasants dies in battle, that means one less person to work the fields, or chop trees, or make clothes, or anything else that you need peasants to do. You only have a small pool of real full-time soldiers. Everyone else is only there when you call them up to defend their homes. They are only soldiers when needed, not all the time. That is a more modern convention that people who are soldiers are full-time soldiers. For most of history, militias were called up and were made up of the common people. They were not good at fighting, it was not their profession, they were just there as needed. The game also has your little subjects actually going through their life. You can follow someone on the map going from their job to church and then going back to home to relax. You can even watch them do their job if they work outside. The whole game really feels alive. You can see somebody mining, or chopping down a tree, or hunting. I think Manor Lords really threads the needle for a game where they have to, sort of mix historical realism and fun without sliding into sort of having too much realism to where it's not fun anymore. I think they did a really good job. It really has a lot of cool systems, like the mentioned combat system, along with the changing of the seasons, which really makes you feel more immersed, like you were alive back then. Most of the game is you preparing for the winter that year. When the months start to get cold, you really do worry. Do I have enough food? Is there enough firewood? Somebody might starve, not me obviously because I'm a lord, but somebody's going to. Is there anything else I can do? I just think this game has a lot of replayability. Due to the dynamically generated maps, you will never play on the same map twice, which makes every town you build different. Maybe one time your town spawns next to an iron deposit, and the next game there's no iron in sight. I think Manor Lord does a really good job at sort of encouraging replayability, and it's being continually updated. This game has been a long time in the making. It is a one-person dev team. I don't believe that they've expanded at all since the game came out. And they're still releasing continual updates, as well as asking for community feedback about what to add next, what people like, what they don't. The dev is very reactive to criticisms and concerns that players have. I think Manor Lord, it's a lot more than just a regular medieval game. I think it's a love letter to a more forgotten part of history, a more realistic part of history that I think people can relate to. It has innovative mechanics and historical realism that creates an experience that's both engaging and thought-provoking. I think it respects history without sacrificing fun, which is a pretty rare balance for a game to achieve. That's all I have. Thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe. I did just create a Twitter, which I'll include the link to down below. Please go and follow me on there. You'll get to see a more personal look at me. not that I'm too exciting, but that's all I got. Like, subscribe, and please remember that Jesus loves you.